Hey guys, so this week we're talking about quantification and mechanization and this idea of um, our attempts to quantify different psychological variables and start to understand how the body works and then ultimately how the brain works through an understanding of the nervous system. So I think that a lot of people touched on the idea that quantification is incredibly critical um, as we unpack the history of psychology because it sort of defines when psychology breaks away officially from philosophy and starts to become a science in its own right. We start to develop the ability to measure variables and to study things, to undergo research um, on psychological principles and ideas. um, Descartes was somebody that a lot of people talked about, and I had never I was aware of him as a philosopher, but certainly not as somebody that contributed to psychology. And I thought it was really interesting how his ideas were pretty far off the mark, but he was one of the only ones that was really taking a stab at it at the time, and he came up with this idea that was sort of based on um, different machines that were in use at the time, and specifically systems of piping. And he sort of imagined that perhaps our bodies and our muscles and maybe even our brains work in a similar fashion. Of course, that turned out not to be correct, but it laid the foundation for other scientists to come in and refine those ideas and study them, test their hypotheses, and sort of prove him wrong. And in doing so, got closer to a more realistic model of how our bodies and our brains work. So a lot of people talked about Galton, who was critical in developing, what we now call statistics and sort of that quantitative side of science, which is absolutely invaluable in terms of, being able to make definitive conclude or draw definitive conclusions when we conduct research. The idea of correlation and statistical regression came from him. Although it's difficult for me to get past, after reading his paper, the sort of ridiculous level of racism. Um, I guess it was just eye opening to me that I'm sure a lot of people thought that way back then, but anyway, it's but I can't deny that he had some definitely critical contributions to the development of psychology as a science, when we're talking about statistics and our ability to quantify and measure variables. And I think what I took away from the discussion is that that's really what matters in terms of psychology breaking away from philosophy is, now instead of just sort of talking about these things that are interesting, we're now able to measure these variables and test hypotheses and actually begin to conduct science. So anyway, thanks for the discussion, guys, and I'll talk to you next week.